Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you like this podcast, you will love my new anthology called Moms Don't Have Time to Have Kids. Check it out, and you'll hear from 49 authors about all sorts of things moms don't have time to do. All the authors have been on this podcast. Also, check out my TikTok, @with Zibby and Tracy, my other podcast, Sex Talk with Zibby and Tracy. Check out Moms Don't Have Time to Write on Medium. And of course, my new publishing company called Zibby Books. And now back to our daily author interview site and a quick hello from some of my kids. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Enjoy the show. Malcolm Gladwell is the author of Miracle and Wonder, Conversations with Paul Simon. He's also the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, Talking to Strangers, and The Bomber Mafia. He is the co-founder and president of Pushkin Industries, an audiobook and podcast production company that produces the podcast Revisionist History, Broken Record, a music interview show, and Solvable, which features innovative thinkers with solutions to some of the world's biggest problems. His latest project is this audio biography called Miracle and Wonder, Conversations with Paul Simon, which is what we spoke about today. You can also listen to my conversation with Malcolm about the Bomber Mafia, which aired several months ago, and watch our Instagram Live. Welcome, Malcolm. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss Miracle and Wonder, all the things about Paul Simon I never knew and was excited to see and hear. And oh my gosh, what an immersive, amazing experience.
Thank you. Thank you. It was super fun to do.
I bet. It sounded like it. I wish I had been sitting there with him. Tell listeners a little bit about, it's not really even a book. It's only an audiobook. It's an audio experience. I feel like this category needs a new name. Tell us about it more.
If you have a name for this category, please let me know. Yes, what is it? We began by me and my friend Bruce. We just sat down with Paul Simon for, I guess it was probably almost 40 hours. So 10 sessions of 4 hours each. And we just talked to him and played music, or he played for us, sang for us. We just hung out, basically. And then we took all that tape and cut it down and wove a kind of argument around it. Try to explain what you're listening to, why you're listening. I had sort of some theories about Paul Simon. I wanted to kind of both run by him and then we put it all together into this thing called Miracle and Wonder, which is 5 hours. And it's supposed to be, the way I pitch it to him is the same way I would pitch it to anyone. Imagine you've never heard of Paul Simon, and like your 11-year-old comes to you and says, "Who is Paul Simon?" And I say, give your 11-year-old this. And it will explain who he is, why he's important, and by the end, you'll be in love with Paul Simon and his music. That's the point.
It's true. I should give my kids this. I should have them listen to it next. That's important.
We can arrange that.
We can arrange that. I know. It's on my phone. I can just, hand it over. They're on my phone all the time anyway. So what's the difference? One of the interesting things you said in the recording was that at an age when many performers slow down or don't create as much anymore, Paul Simon's ramped up in his production. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the things that fascinated me about Paul is his longevity. So we're used to musicians who have this spurt of creativity in their 20s, and then they spend the rest of their career just playing the hits they wrote when they were 25. That's the model. And that's not a criticism. It's really, really hard to write a pop song, right? To write more than one pop song. But along comes Paul Simon, and he had his first hit as a teenager in the 50s. And there are many, we interviewed a bunch of artists, of other musicians about Paul, and some of them, David Byrne, for example, says that his favorite Paul Simon album is the album that Paul Simon made, I think, in 2013 called So Beautiful and So What. So he's made relevant music in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, and 20-teens. That's crazy, right?
Crazy.
So that's sort of what we're trying to get at in the book, is to explain, how is that possible? What is it about this person that allowed him to remain so creatively fertile for so long? And I don't know if we have it's partly an unanswerable question, but we sort of try and I think we get close to sort of at least describing a little bit of what makes Paul Simon so extraordinarily special.
So what is the secret? What is the secret to longevity?
Well, one is that he's an amazing risk taker. And, over the course of his career, he takes a bunch of incredible risks, some of which work out and some of which don't. For example, he's one of the top recording artists in the world when he decides to write a Broadway play, Cape Men. Mm-hmm. And he devotes 2 years of his life trying to master an entirely different creative form. And a play comes out and gets a bad review in the New York Times, and it closes after audiences stay away. And commercially, it's a failure. And to this day, Paul, carries the wounds of that failure. But, in the same spirit is what leads him to go to South Africa in the early 1980s and make Graceland, which is, why not? Let's try something new. Or the same spirit is what, after he breaks up with Art Garfunkel, to recreate himself as a solo artist. I could go on and we over the course of this book, we list all of these chances and risks and experiments that Paul Simon is willing to do. And he's willing to do them even when he's famous and comfortably off. And do you really, 99% of people would say after they'd done Bridge Over Troubled Water, I'm done. I mean, do I need to do anything else? I've done one of the greatest albums. And he just keeps going and taking more chances. And it's as much about his courage and his willingness to fail if in the pursuit of something new, that is incredibly admirable. That's what I took away from my time with him, was that this is a guy with a lot of an appetite for risk and a curiosity that needs to be satisfied, and a willingness to fail, even if in the course of trying to find something new.
Do you think those are things that can be taught? Do you think those are things that you can parent into your kids, that sort of this willingness to try and all of that? Do you think it's just something you're born with?
I suspect at least some portion of it can be taught. I think it's very instructive if you want to talk about parenting in this context. It's incredibly useful for a child to see one of their parents deal gracefully with failure. Now, obviously, catastrophic failure is not good for anyone. If you were to lose your home and your job and your health and all that kind of stuff, that's a trauma that is going to be. But I mean, there's a whole category of failures that I think can be incredibly useful. If you see someone deal, like I say, gracefully with them, learn from them, accept that life has ups and downs, find some silver lining, all those kinds of things, come back, and show resilience. Those are things, I think resilience is very much something that can be taught. You have to see someone rebound from a setback before you know that rebounding from a setback is possible.
I mean, what you said about Paul Simon a minute ago, by the way, could easily apply to you. I mean, people could say, why would Malcolm Gladwell write another book after The Tipping Point? Why bother after Outliers? Why would he keep going? Why do you keep going?
Zibby, what would I do? I sitting at home. I think the same is true. I don't mean to put myself in the same category as Paul Simon, who is, he's like one of the great musical geniuses of his generation. He likes writing music. He likes messing around with music. It just makes him happy. I don't even think it matters to him whether the song he's working on is a massive hit or not a massive hit. He just enjoys that. And I enjoy, yesterday morning, I did an interview with this cop. I was in Los Angeles, this 82-year-old retired LAPD officer. It's 2 hours long. And at the end of it, I was like, I just love the excuse to talk to people I would never otherwise talk to. I would never, if I didn't have some project I was working on, I would never meet that guy. Mm-hmm. I would never have occasion to ask him questions for 2 hours. I would never have heard all these crazy stories. Do I know whether I'll use any of that interview? I don't. Do I know whether the product that comes out of that will be successful? I don't. It doesn't matter though, because I had fun. I learned this. He's like, he was this character. Like I now have a character in my memory and in my life that I didn't have before. And I feel Paul's the same way. He's 80, 79 years old. He has an album coming out in March. Does he care whether he'd like it to be successful, but I think he just enjoyed making it. Right.
So maybe that's another one of the secrets, right? I mean, maybe he's thinking the same thing. What would he do if he wasn't, if sometimes like these ways of expressing ourselves is how we live, right? You might as well. And some people's can be more for public consumption than other people's.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that was great about was we spent all this time with him, 40 hours, and he was enjoying himself. Some people, you know this, you interview people for a living. Sometimes when you interview people, it feels like work for them. They're required to do it or they're supposed to do it and they'd really rather be somewhere else. He never gave the sense that he would rather be somewhere else. He was just up for it because it was like, we were talking about music. And for him, I joked to him once, and I can't remember whether this is in the book, that his truest calling would have been as a music teacher. No, he would have been the most overqualified music teacher of all time. But he just wants to tell people about how to make music and how music works. That's what made him. So the idea that we were going to come and sit with him for as long as all of us wanted to sit, and he could just talk about how his mind works and how music works for him, and we would be willing listeners. To him, that was like, he was just like, psyched. Like that was fun, And he would always, at the end of every session, he would always say, "Should we do this again?" Like he wasn't like, "Are we done?" He was always like, "Can we do this again?" We were always like, "Yes."
I mean, people love talking about what they're passionate about. That's why what you were saying, like, people who feel, when you interview them, who feel like, you can tell when they don't want to be there. I feel like, and you interview people all the time, like, isn't that my job to make them have fun and want to be there and chatting with me? Otherwise, I've failed. Like that's my fault then.
Yeah, I think that's true. And yeah, part of the job, I think that interviewing, it's funny, this is a tangent, but there's a lot of people now who have podcasts and have taken up the job of interviewer. And I think sometimes people don't understand how hard it is. I would say for the first 20 years of my career in journalism, I was not a very good interviewer. It took a long time understanding how to find what's interesting in another person, because sometimes people need a little help in locating. I think everyone is interesting, but a lot of us need help in finding what is interesting about our experiences. And that's what an interviewer does. And they encourage you and they infect you with their enthusiasm. And that's not an easy task. Like that, it takes years to figure out how to do that.
I guess. I don't know. Are we having fun? Are you having fun? I hope I'm doing my job well.
I'm having a blast.
Oh my gosh. Wait, so tell me a little more about Pushkin's, the way you've reconceptualized books, because this is like a huge, amazing thing that you're doing. And yeah. I want to make sure everybody understands how cool it is, because what you're essentially doing is you're taking what could be a book and everything is enhanced and more interesting. And, when I listen to the Bomber Mafia, it's like started there with like the clips and the airplanes and the, actual news clips. And now here with like literally just listening to Paul Simon perform as you guys are chit chat. I mean, it's so cool. So how did that whole thing come about? And like, what's coming next and all this cool stuff that you're doing?
Well, we thought that audiobooks in particular were just people, you'd write a book and then they would sit you down in a studio for 3 days and you would read the book into a microphone. And that's always struck me as a total waste. Like there's all this, why would you squander all the potential of audio just by reading, sitting in a closet and reading for 3 days? You're like, for example, if you interview somebody, and I did this with Talking to Strangers, started with that book. Everyone I interviewed, I taped them. And then in the audiobook, you heard them. Not me reading their words, you heard them in their words. And then you realize, if you think about a movie, have you ever watched a movie, an early cut of a movie that doesn't have a soundtrack?
Yes, actually.
And it's bizarre how bad it is, right?
I've watched I was in a sound studio with my brother, who's a producer, while they were trying to get the sound right. So they would show us like the clips with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would show us like, and here's what it sounds like when the door locks. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Anyway.
So much better, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, then I thought, well, audiobooks should have soundtracks. They should have theme music. There's all these things that just can add to the emotion and make the experience so much more captivating. So, you can't now when we do an audiobook, we have these brilliant musicians who score it for us, the same way you would a movie.
Mm-hmm.
For Talking to Strangers, Janelle Monáe had this unbelievable kind of protest song that she wrote about all the police shootings. And I called up her manager and I was like, because Talking to Strangers began and ended with the story of an encounter between an African-American woman and I called up her manager and said, I have to have that song. I mean, that song belongs in my book. I mean, she was like, absolutely. And so you hear that song throughout my book. And that's because with audio, I can go to a genius like Janelle Monáe and I can say, can I borrow a little bit of your genius to help my book, be more moving and powerful? And so there's all these opportunities, same thing with the Paul Simon book. I mean, we could have written a print book about him, but then you don't get to hear Paul Simon. Mm-hmm. You don't get to hear him play and mess around on the guitar and tell funny jokes and just be his kind of beautifully weird, wonderful self. I wanted you to feel like you're in the room with us. And you can do that with audio. You can't do that on the page. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is to create a kind of intimacy with the listener.
And what about just doing a why didn't you make it a documentary?
Because once you add cameras, everything gets 100 times more expensive and 100 times harder. And I don't know I think that people get shy around, not shy. I think sometimes the camera makes people self-conscious, particularly musicians. Paul's not an actor. He's a musician. He wants to be heard. He doesn't need to be seen. That dimension's not important. I don't know if anything would be added. I think sometimes as well, video images can be a distraction. Now, for certain kinds of stories, they're not a distraction. They are the story. But for a book about a musician and his genius, the images are a distraction. I want you to listen. I want you to close your eyes and listen. I don't want to show pictures of a guy with a guitar. That's not the point here. The point here is to train your ear to appreciate the genius of this transcendent artist.
So cool. Well, I mean, I was already a Paul Simon fan, but it's hard to listen without even having a renewed appreciation.
Aren't you wait, let's talk about this for a second.
Uh-oh.
No. You're kind of the quintessential, you grew up in New York.
I did.
And do you grow up in Manhattan or in Manhattan?
Manhattan.
Yeah. But your parents and grandparents would be roughly the same age as Paul, and you're generationally, there's a whole group of Paul Simon fans for whom Paul was New Yorkers. He was one generation older. They grew up on when you were 10, I'm sure somebody played the Boxer for him.
We had Graceland in our permanent, the 6 CD thing that slid out. We always had it in there. And we would bring it with us on vacation and then play it there.
So you're of that generation that as a kid, his music was all around you.
Yeah.
And as a New Yorker, I always feel there's a special bond between Paul Simon, who's such a quintessential New Yorker, and New Yorkers. There's something about that. His song American Tune, one of his most beautiful songs, it's a song really about the immigrant experience in America. And if you're the child or grandchild or great-grandchild of immigrants to this country, there's something about that song and him that just connects. If your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came over, at Ellis Island from escaping whatever and to this thing called America, it's that song can bring you to tears. And so there's a bond there between. So my point is, I'm not surprised that this book spoke.
Okay. Phew. I didn't know where you were going with that. Anyway. All right. So Paul Simon, now this project is done, out and about, and now into the world, converting more Paul Simon fans. What are you doing next? Who are you having, aside from the policeman? What are your next couple projects? What's your big vision?
There is a project there's a big thing I'm working on now, my next book, which does involve Los Angeles. It's all about it. It's a Los Angeles story. So I've been hanging out in LA a lot and talking to people like 82-year-old retired LAPD officers. That's something I've been working on for the last while. I have a revisions history season 7 comes up this summer, and I'm just about to start work on that. And I'm in that stage where I'm desperate for ideas. And I wake up at 3 a.m, I think, in a cold panic and think, what if I don't come up with enough ideas for this year? And then Pushkin, we get a bunch of really cool things. We're doing another similar book project with the comedian Steve Martin.
Oh, wow.
Because we thought it'd be really fun. Comedians also, you want to hear them, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's something else we're thinking about.
That's exciting. No, it's true. There is this immediacy with audio that is not the same, right? Because basically it's literally immersive, right? You're like putting the sound into your body directly, like an infusion, as opposed to the separation. I mean, obviously, yeah. But anyway. Well, those sound great. Amazing. Okay. Do you have any advice? Let's say people want to record the best audio experience they possibly can. What should they do? How can they, aside from getting out of a closet, like what can they do to enhance? Because a lot of other people get assigned audiobooks to read, right? They don't have this opportunity. Like, what can they do to make it better? Or is there anything? Or I don't know.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it is to think about. One is that the thing about audio is that it's intimate and it's emotional. So anything you can do to enhance that part of it is super, super important. So like I said earlier about that feeling of being in the room with someone, that's what you want. So, in Miracle and Wonder, this Paul Simon book, we deliberately included little bits of our conversation that were casual, like, some of the chapters begin with this little bits of tape. And what you're trying to do with that is to give you a sense of the informal, intimate Paul Simon, not the, when you're being interviewed, you put on your interview hat and you answer every question clearly and precisely. And it's a formal process. But with an audiobook, you have an opportunity to do something different, which is to make it just feel like you're chit-chatting with somebody. You're just hanging out. So anything you can do to enhance that kind of, and that means being comfortable with a certain kind of imperfection sometimes, being comfortable with things that are, where the purpose of including something is not necessarily to make an argument or a point, but to create a feeling. In a book, you don't do things. In a print book, you don't do things to create feelings. You do things to make your argument, to prove a point. In an audiobook, you really want feeling. You want to hear. There's a moment in this book where Paul talks about the fact that his mother, he told us this at least 3 times. His mother once said, when he was very young and just starting out with Art Garfunkel, Paul, you have a good voice, but Artie has a great voice. And he still remembers that. It really hurt his feelings. His own mother. Yeah. And it's really important for you to hear how he says that and to feel the idea that even someone as ridiculously accomplished as this still carries that little bit of hurt. Not because he's fragile. He's the opposite of fragile. He's an insanely resilient guy. But his mom said something that wounded him and that also spurred him on, that he's used as a driver of his ambition and his creativity. It's just really, really, really important to hear how that.
Well, now I'm like,
Yeah, I know what you're thinking.
I'm right. I'm like, great. I say one thing to my kids and, it's going to be.
And if your kid turns out to be Paul as good, as famous and as accomplished as Paul Simon, then that's probably a very useful thing to have said.
Yeah, but then he's going to talk about what I said that made him feel bad, and I'm going to look like the mean person after all his success. So I don't know. It's a lose-lose.
40 years from now, you're listening to your son being interviewed, and he says, "And then my mom said, and I'll never forget." And you're totally. Like daggers in your heart.
Totally. Oh my gosh. Well, I'll use the next 40 years to steel myself against that eventual hurt. Oh my gosh. All right. Well, Malcolm, thank you so much. Thanks for chatting today. I had fun, and thanks for sharing all your feelings and everything.
Yeah,
all right. Have a great day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.